Now that we've discussed some of the conditions and circumstances surrounding the industrial workplace, I want to now turn our attention to how workers responded to these conditions and circumstances and some of the methods that they use to hopefully improve the pay, the hours, the safety concerns, and establish certain rights and protections for employees from abuse of employers. One of the earlier concepts we discussed about business's influence in politics and society is very important when we consider how employees sought to improve workplace conditions. One of the contributing factors to the emergence of industrialization, and something we've discussed earlier in the class in the industrial equation, was that government really tended to stay out of business affairs. This is a period where a government intervention had yet to be thought necessary, and the kind of traditional attitudes was that business and government should be separate from this, and also to consider that these are such new questions. You know, there never really been these societal type questions about workplace conditions and workers' rights on this scale and this magnitude. But then, and two, you add the fact that business during this time exerted tremendous influence in both society and politics. So it really left the worker, in many ways, at the mercy of so many things, right? Is the mercy of the economy, the mercy of the employer. And there really just wasn't a lot of bargaining chips that the worker had to improve conditions such as pay, hours, and maybe benefits like today we think of health care, and retirement benefits and pensions. So, how did American workers respond to these conditions and seek now to improve those? And when we think about that, we should turn our attention to labor unions. A labor union is an organized association of workers, often in a trade or a profession, that come together, they form this group to protect and further their rights and interests. So if we think in this period, if we were to form a labor union, the things that should be at the forefront of our mind go back to those workplace conditions of long hours, low pay, dangerous, unsanitary environments, and rights, worker protections, protections from that prevent employers for firing individuals, whether it be a personal vendetta or in a ways that are able to abuse these individuals in some sort of manner. So when we think of labor unions, again, it's about organization of laborers and workers, right? What does that really mean? Is one of the things to think about when it comes to labor unions is what happens if you're an employee working in these type of conditions and you're not part of a labor union, or the union does not exist. Well, if you are trying to negotiate pay increase or safety conditions or changes, it's kind of you versus the employer on an individual level. And we saw that one of the principles of this increased economy was to de-skill labor and to make them replaceable. So that is a gamble right there if you are individually trying to muscle the owner into better conditions. So what do? You you band together and you unionize. And the goal of a union is to collectively bargain as a workforce with the employer. So instead of an individual employee employer, it's the employer and the employees, right? So this was the real vehicle that laborers used during the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, and even on into the 20th century. Continued. The legacy expands for labor unions. This is how employees sought to improve um, their circumstances through collective bargaining. So when we think of this, what we're going to do now is we're going to look at three labor unions And I want you to, as you think, as we discuss these labor unions, to take note of the decade, the year. So we want to place them in context, time. And we also want to associate, because we want to support our discussions with detail, that we want you should be accountable to for the leaders that we tend to associate with these organizations. So the three labor unions we're going to discuss are the National Labor Union, the Knights of Labor, and the AFL, or the American Federation of Labor. William Silvis leads the National Labor Union from 1866 to 1873. Terence Powderly will be the main force behind the Knights of Labor from 1869 to 1886. Now, he wasn't in leadership the whole time, but he is the individual that we associate with the Knights of Labor. And last, Samuel Gompers and the American Federation of Labor. So, as we think of labor unions and collective bargaining as an effort to improve workers' circumstances, one of the vehicles that they did this, or one of the tools that they used, unions used sometimes effectively and sometimes counterproductively, was the implementation of labor strikes. And we're going to look at four specific labor strikes: the Great Southwest Railroad Strike of 1886, one that's the Haymarket Square incident was not a full on strike because of the circumstances surrounding it, but is an incident that we will categorize in the labor strike category. And the Homestead Strike of 1892 and the Pullman Strike of 1894. I'll add that date shortly. So let's first turn our attention to the very first national or significant labor union of the 1860s. Now, there's some small pockets of union activity before the 1860s, but think of this: we're in the post Civil War. The Civil War is over now, they're in the midst of Reconstruction. And some of these conditions are starting to manifest themselves throughout society. So we see this first significant labor union, the National Labor Union. It's headed by William Silvis, and their main platform advocated for 8-hour workdays, higher wages. But there's also some other aspects that we can look at and try to see how they're related to labor. Should be our questions: currency and banking reforms, into convict labor, restrictions on immigration. And so, what I think, if you looked deeper into those three, because those work hours and wages is easy to see as a worker cause, but currency and banking reforms, interest rates, and how mortgages work and how taxes on those are collected, currency reforms, whether trying to depreciate or in currency value or inflate it to appreciate it. All of these things affect the worker and their ability to survive in an industrial society. So these are difficult concepts, but related to workers. Convict labor, the use of convict labor was an element that was used to depress wages for workers. So and also immigration, the flood of immigration provided competition in the workplace that also depressed wages, that also depressed wages. Now, another aspect. So there's two challenging aspects. The National Labor Union kind of ran into two main adver. There were really two challenging components when it came to the National Labor Union. One is their platform was very diverse, and when you talk about convict labor, immigration restrictions, and banking and currency reforms, you're talking about political components of society that aren't negotiated between employee and employer. So, as they're advocating for these grandiose type ideals, they're often very difficult to obtain. Another component that was a challenge for the National Labor Union is that they tried to unite all workers together, right? And that is that this was an open union to all employees. So their goal is that if we open this union to all workers, that we can get such a large group that it will exert influence. The problem or the challenge to that is that there's such a diversity of interest among those groups, whether it be garment workers or in Massachusetts, textile workers in North Carolina, railroad workers, and steel workers, is that those interests are sometimes hard to bring together. So that diversity also served as a challenge. And this is what William Silvis described as the goal of the National Labor Union. He said, "Our cause is a common one. It's a war between poverty and wealth. This moneyed power is fast eating up the substance of the people. We have made war upon it, and we mean to win it. If we can, we will win through the ballot box. If not, we shall resort to sterner means." Now, if you're a businessman and you hear that your employees, using this type of language, war, right, as we'll try to do it through the ballot box, but sterner measures than necessary, you can automatically, I would hope, you can start to see that attitudes about who's in the right, who's in the wrong about this, really are going to be important to the national discussion. When William Silvis passed away, so did ultimately the National Labor Union. It was replaced by the Knights of Labor that originally started out as a secret organization. And I think that continuing to talk about perceptions of workers and employees and employers and the fear of retribution potentially from an employer for unionizing or advocating for employee rights. You can see that in these really kind of clandestine origins of the Knights of Labor. But as the Knights of Labor became a public entity and was led by an individual by name Terence Powderly, they adopted a platform of 8-hour work days. As you can see, that's a worker interest, equal pay for women, also trying to combat some of these strategies that were used to depress wages. So if you can use child labor, that's going to depress the worker of the adult, the wage of an adult. Or if you pay women less than men, you can actually use that as a business model to keep wages low by employing women instead. They sought to end child and convict labor, and also a graduated income tax was part of their platform. Now, a graduated income tax is a concept that we have today built into American society, and that is that every individual doesn't have the same tax obligation to the United States. And what, as you start to see, is that there's an idea that now maybe as the more you make, potentially the more opportunity you could contribute to income tax to the United States. Now, these are new ideas at the time because an income tax is not even established. A withholding income tax wasn't established until the 20th century. And, but this is starting to show the changes in considerations of taxation. Should it be based on land anymore, or income, or wealth in general? So the graduated income tax sought to alleviate some of the tax burden on the laborer and to shift that burden to the wealthier aspects of society. You can see this as while it is in a labor agenda, or there's some aspects that are related to labor, this would be something that has to be done through the political system. So one of those challenges that face the National Labor Union, you can also see some of these challenges facing the Knights of Labor. But there was also even more radical components to the Knights of Labor, and one was employee employer cooperative ownership. So where employees weren't just wage laborers, but instead had a vested ownership in the country, in the corporation, whether that be in percentages based on profits or shares in that company. But what this tells us is that ideas about private ownership and the relationship between the owner of a company and the people who are making that company work on a daily basis, there's some real people are starting to ask questions about those concepts during the period. There's also some interesting components to the Knights of Labor, like their exclusive membership. So instead of opening up to all workers or all people, they did put some limitations on this, and some can be seen in their agenda. The bankers, the stockbrokers, the physicians, the lawyers, those individuals were seen as kind of assets of the employer class. And then this is the other odd component, no professional gamblers or liquor dealers. And this tells us, too, that people are starting to grapple with societal changes that are challenging ethical and moral norms that are coming about with urbanization. And they're really seeing some of these connections, right, between society and this transformation of the industrial workplace. And then you also see lingering, or not lingering, but just alive concepts of race and racism and in the exclusion of African Americans. And for many northern industrial workers, they saw African Americans potentially coming from the South as competition in the labor force. Right. So one of the components of the Knights of Labor, one of the main strategies, should I say, one of the main strategies of labor unions to place pressure and negotiate this collective bargaining with employers. What happens when those negotiations don't go well? What can employees do? And one of the main components or greatest and most dramatic tools of unions was the labor strike. Is that to force industries and employers to improve workplace conditions, they would withhold their labor. Now, this took all of the workers in an industry or in a company and even beyond that company banding together. So there's put some lot of pressures on the union. And this is kind of a gamble that you take in a last resort. So what this requires, though, is this is where you see those labor dues really coming into play. Is that if you're going to try to strike and keep an entire workforce off the job, you really have to have some plans in place of how to keep their families fed, how to help pay their bills, to make sure that they don't cross the picket line. And that is ultimately kind of the game of chicken that you play in a strike, is who caves first, the workers or the owner of the company. Now, Terence Powderly was particularly adverse to labor strikes. He was fearful that a labor strike could do a couple of things bad that would actually set labor back. One is that by calling for better conditions and lower hours, you don't want to appear as a group of complainers. And by quitting work, by complaining that work is too hard, is there it can be manipulated in the narrative, or at least you don't want to come out looking like the bad guy. On top of that, if you do show your cards and try to strike and it doesn't work, it really reinforces the strength and position of those for those entities that you were trying to influence before. So the fear is that you could lose the PR battle and this backfire upon you. There are four strikes I think that I think are helpful to understanding what's going on in American society as unions are forming, as they're trying to collectively bargain, and as the strike becomes a key weapon in their effort to improve these conditions. And the first place to look is a very violent and turbulent year of 1886. It starts with the Southwest Railroad or Southwest Railroad strike. This goes beyond just a single railroad, but over the next 2 months after a railroad employee was fired, right? So this would for attending a union meeting. So they're trying to start the Knights of Labor up in Texas at the time. There was not a strong foothold. They're getting their start, and one of the railroad workers just attended a meeting. He didn't even join the union yet. and he was fired. Word was, the manager got word of this, and he was fired. So this type of action would fall back into that category we were talking about of the lack of protections for employees and blacklisting. Is that this is showing that a company could really go after an individual that they saw as problematic. So, over the next 2 months, the strike involved more than 200,000 railroad workers, and it erupted into violence. Is that there was a real antagonistic relationship between the company and these workers that developed. Whether it be, these are headlines from the period right here, is that dynamite was found in a supposed attempt to blow up Fort Worth Depot. And so that there were these strikers potentially making terrorist attacks at the company to prevent it from running. But there's also, on the other hand, on the other side, some real kind of shady business going on from the company. Is that there were instances of homes being searched under suspicion of terroristic acts, and really this is people them going after union members. There are examples of where the company denied or told businesses not to work with employees, or else that they would push on them. So, don't, this grocery store, they go to the owner and say, don't sell groceries to this individual. Now, this is what it's at this moment, right? This friction that develops, that, and you can look just the juxtaposition of these two headlines, that you can see why Terrence Powderly potentially is fearful of a labor strike, and of a failed labor strike. And that is the idea that you don't want the worker to look worse in the end, or to lose ground. And you can see this in discussions of labor unions today, and you can look in professional sports. And actually, that was one of the main reasons that NFL players advocated for the passing of their new collective bargaining act, which just happened last week, because they were afraid that if they didn't pass this and they did strike and it didn't work, that they would actually get less than this deal. So here's some claims right here about the behaviors of the business of Jay Gould's railroad. Jay Gould owned the Southwest Railroad. And here is a description of why they're upset, and what they're at, why they're striking, and what they are fighting against. They wrote, "There stands before us a giant of aggregated and incorporated wealth, every dollar of which is built upon blood and injustice and outrage. Our strong arms have grown weary in building the tower of his strength, and yet he builds us to build or die. Our young lives have grown gray, too, so soon beneath the strain of unrequiting, constant toil." So what they're saying there is this man's wealth has been built by their hard work. And then this next line, our young lives have grown gray too soon beneath the strain of unrequiting, constant toil, is that they've worked so hard that they're aging at a rate that they're giving their lives away to their work, and not necessarily because it's their career, but that's what it takes to survive. It says this: "Our loved ones at home are hollow-cheeked and pale, with long, weary waiting for better days to come." So they're all of these conditions, and they're not providing for their families. Nay, more than this, the graveyards are hiding his victim from out longing eyes. Brother workman, this monster fiend has compelled some of us to toil in the cold and rain for 50 cents a day. Others have been compelled to yield their time to him for 17 and 30 weary hours for a pittance of 9 hours of pay. Others who have dared to assert their manhood and rebel against his tyranny are blacklisted and boycotted all over the land. See, that is one, again, going back to one of the strategies that prevented workers' rights. He has made a solemn compact with the highest authority in our order, and then has basely refused to fulfill pledges. So that he's an untrustworthy owner, is what they're saying. He lives under and enjoys all the benefits of a republican form of government. So the government protects his rights and his interests, and yet advocates and perpetuates the most debasing form of white slavery. He robs rich and poor, high and low, with ruthless hand, and then appeals to corrupt and purchased courts to help him take our little homes away. So, what they're describing is an individual who is using the tools of the justice system or using government as a tool in his business interests. He breaks our limbs, maims our bodies, and demands that we shall release him from every claim of damages or be blacklisted forever. He goes to our grocers and persuades them not to give us credit because we refuse to be ground in his business mill. He turns upon us a horde of lawless thugs who shoot among our wives and children in deadly intent, and then he howls for the government. So you see, this shows the caustic relationship that has developed by the 1880s between labor and laborers and employers. And then there's another incident, and the one that is particularly violent, with the Haymarket Square riot of 1886. And this is an incident that takes place in Chicago in 1886, where there was violence between laborers, anarchists, though, as well, people with a government agenda, and the police. And so let's take a little moment to learn a little bit more about the tension that was growing in 1886, and potentially, I think you might be able to see here how some of the fears that Terence Powderly had about strikes going wrong are could be potentially backfire in labor interests.
The Haymarket Square riot of 1886 had its origins in labor unrest that extended back to the decades after the Civil War. American laborers were particularly concerned about issues including the length of the workday and working conditions. The American labor movement at that time was also being influenced by more radical voices. Many of these individuals believed that not only should working conditions be improved, but that the entire capitalistic enterprise be smashed. On May 3rd, 1886, several workers were killed by police in a showdown at the McCormick Reaper plant in Chicago. Labor organizers called for a mass meeting and rally the following night at Haymarket Square. After one speaker, Samuel Felden, made a particularly inflammatory statement, police moved in to shut down the rally. As they were moving toward the stage, however, an unknown person tossed a bomb in their midst. In the ensuing violence, 7 police officers were killed, and as many as 5 civilians wounded. In the absence of any real suspects, authorities turned their attention to the more radical influences in the labor movement. Despite the lack of any tangible evidence, 8 men were eventually arrested and put on trial. All 8 were convicted. In the end, 4 of those convicted were executed on November 11, 1887. Of the 3 remaining who had been convicted, 1 committed suicide, and the other 2 were ultimately pardoned by the governor of Illinois due to a public backlash against the unfair way in which the defendants had been treated. The 4 men who were executed in 1887 became international symbols of the struggle between capital and labor and the fight to ensure fair labor practices for all workers.
Terence Powderly's concerns about the effectiveness of strikes as a real means of advancing labor interests, or at least his concerns of how failed strikes or lost strikes can lead to counterproductive gains for the laborers, did manifest in the turmoil in that lightning rod of a year of 1886. And the following year would ultimately be replaced by the American Federation of Labor. And now, one of the interesting components after the incidents of 1886 is how labor started, particularly under the leadership of Samuel Gompers and the American Federation of Labor, really started to zero in their achievable goals for these unions. And some of the challenges of the previous major unions, whether it be the National Labor Union or the Knights of Labor, were offset by the laser focus of the American Federation of Labor, who really looked to first, they appealed to craftsmen and tradesmen, and now this did not bode well for the common laborer, but it did help advance the interest of the industrial labor in many capacities. The other component that they did is focus in on achievable goals of better work conditions, shorter hours, and higher wages. But the clash, and the dramatic clash and violent clash between labor and businesses and business owners was not over yet. For the 1890s were also a turbulent year. And once again, we see the onset of those booms and busts. That economic contraction that occurred in 1893 really spurs along the events of many of these very iconic moments and the battles and the struggles between union and work and business in the late 19th century. So let's turn our attention at the Homestead strike of 1892. That really is one of the most highly thought of and violent episodes in American labor struggles. This happened under an Andrew Carnegie's corporation, the Homestead Steel Works, and it was managed by Henry Frick, who was bitterly stubborn in so many ways in his approaches to dealing with unions, and a very shrewd business manager. Frick was a large part of Andrew Carnegie's success, and after this moment, Carnegie would distance himself from Frick, and Frick really felt betrayed by Carnegie by much of this. But in 1892, Henry Frick announced that they were going to cut wages at nearly 20% for Homestead steel workers, and the workers thought that they had enough leverage to institute a strike and at least offset these wage cuts. But Frick was also ready to push his chips in, and he brought in scab workers that would be escorted by armed Pinkerton agents, and a small-scale battle would occur between these Pinkerton agents and workers from the Homestead Steel Works factory. Let's take a moment to take a peek at some of the details of this Homestead incident.
Andrew Carnegie sets his sights on a struggling steel mill outside Pittsburgh, with plans to make it the largest in his steel-making empire. Carnegie invests millions, retooling the plant to turn out more structural steel than any other mill of its size. The Homestead Steel Works is a true modern marvel. But it can't operate without manpower. To keep profits growing, Carnegie needs to continue cutting costs, including wages. But he's also determined to repair his image. So he turns to his chairman to do the dirty work. Henry Frick has never been concerned with what people think of his methods. He's about one thing: winning. The conditions are dangerous, and a small group of men bands together to raise their concerns. Unions are relatively new in America, and Frick isn't about to let them take root on his watch. He ramps up production, pushing his men harder than ever. In case of a strike, he'll have a stockpile of finished steel. The men are spending half their lives in the dreadful and dangerous conditions. And they're about to reach their breaking point. Accidents on the plant floor keep multiplying. Death has the potential to unite the overwhelmed workforce. knowing his boss has his back, Frick throws the first punch. He tells workers that Carnegie Steel won't negotiate, and conditions won't be improving.
The Carnegie Company has wiped out organization in the Edgar Thomson Works, has wiped out organization in the Coke region, and are about to wipe out organization in Homestead. No! The time has come to send Mr. Frick a message. That's right. We do not accept the new pay scale. No. We do not accept the poor working conditions. No. We do not accept the long hours. No. And why can we do this? Because we are a union. Yeah! And nobody will break us. Yeah! All those in favor of striking, raise your hands. Yeah!
2,000 steelworkers barricade the front of the plant to prevent Frick from bringing in replacements. But Frick isn't about to back down. He calls in reinforcements. Under pressure to quell the revolt, Frick brings in the Pinkertons, a mercenary army capable of outgunning the U.S. military.
Tear down this barricade! Fire!
When the fighting stops, 9 Carnegie Steel workers lie dead, while countless others sustain severe injuries. But they manage to hold their ground until Pennsylvania's governor sends in the state militia to finally restore order. Homestead is back in the hands of management.
Start
There's one more incident in 1894 that I think it merits our discussion in analyzing the relationship between labor and business in this industrial development era. And if we look to the Pullman strike, it involves a company known as the Pullman Company, which produced a range of railroad car types from luxury dining cars and parlor cars to freight cars. The Pullman sleeper car is well known. It's like the high-end first class where individuals would buy these personalized train cars, much like someone may have a personalized yacht or their own yacht or a private plane today. They were built in this town of Pullman, which was established by George Pullman, the owner of the Pullman Car Company. And it was this town that he not only established, but I feel like I've got stuff from this. Okay, there's one final moment or event that occurs in the 1890s that is worth our discussion and helps us to continue to see not only the conditions facing workers in the United States, but also the relationship between workers and business, and also ideas of, or also that one other element we've been looking at is how do individuals harness collective bargaining strategies to potentially push forward the labor agenda. So this incident occurs in 1894 involving the Pullman Company. The Pullman Company produced a range of railroad cars, like luxury, ranging from luxury dining cars, sleeper cars, to freight cars. And so think about this as during the industry where railroad is the symbol of transportation and development. The elite and many, these are the high-end cars that people would purchase, and they would, the first class cars that would be on passenger trains, people would individually purchase them, companies would purchase them. So these were built in the town of Pullman, and George Pullman, who owned the company, also established this town, and he owned the town and the housing and the stores in the town, and also but this was a place for his workers to live, and they would rent from him. And so they would be working at this factory, and then taking their wages and plugging them right back into the Pullman money machine. And so think of that as like almost a aspect of vertical integration in so many ways, and economics of scope. So there was a severe economic downturn in 1893 that caused the company to institute a series of wage cuts. And it was these conditions that facilitated the Pullman strike in 1894. And what I like to show you is that you can also click this hyperlink if you get to the Google slide presentation in Moodle, and you can read this full statement. But this is from the Pullman Car Company workers, employees from that, who were appealing to the American Railway Union to help support them in their boycott and strike against the Pullman Car Company. And they are listing their grievances, and so it's really, you can see a lot of the concepts that we've been talking about by exploring this statement. And I'm just going to take some segments from it. I encourage you to read it entirely on your own. It's not that long. So they say, in stating this body, so they're making a presentation to this union meeting, this big union meeting in Chicago. And they're saying, this is why we're here and what we need your help with. In stating to this body our grievances, it's hard to tell you where to begin. There's a long list, obviously. But most of you, they go on to say, is to know that the proximate cause, like what really set this off, was a grievance between George Pullman and some of his associates and representatives from the Pullman Car Union that have been guaranteed immunity as they discuss the relationship between the company and the union. They said, come to the table, we'll talk, we're going to try to negotiate this, and you don't have to have fear of retaliation from us. But then two of these people were fired, and so this was the straw that broke the camel's back. But then they go on to say, it's really, though, the more remote causes are still imminent. 5 reduction in wages, in work, and conditions of employment swept through the shops of Pullman between May and December of 1893. So they're saying, over the last 8 months, there have been 5 pay cuts to the workforce. The last was the most severe, amounting to nearly 30%. And our rents had not fallen. They were in debt to Pullman to the tune of $70,000 when they began the strike, and now they went on to say that they owe him twice as much today. And they also try to articulate why Pullman hasn't evicted them from their homes and keeps this debt running. And they cite 2 things. Is that one, that he's trying to not look bad to the world for evicting people in this kind of downturn. And then second, he is just playing the long game where they'll break and ultimately he'll profit even more in the end. So they continue and say, they start talking about the rents they're paying him and how they're exorbitant, and in their mind is that their pay has been cut significantly over the past year, but their rent has not decreased. And they compare it to this adjacent town in Roseland where they say they could rent for $8, but because it's owned by Pullman, it's going to be $15. Basically, they then go on to say why even the very streets are his. They talk about they're named after him and his associates, and he owns the stores. And they went on to then address when they met with Pullman. And they said, when we went to tell him of our grievances, he said we were all his children, like he cared for them. Pullman, both the man and the town, though, they said, is an ulcer to the body politic. He owns the houses, the schoolhouses, the churches of God in town, and he gave his once humble name. The revenue he derives from these, the wages he pays out with one hand, the Pullman Palace Car Company, he takes back with the other hand in the Pullman Land Association. So what this strike really signified, I think that we need to connect to our themes. Workers and employees did not seem to have a lot of availability to appeal through the political system, and the influence of business, not only through politics but also through society, was so powerful at this time that labor really had seemed to believe that the appropriate way and the best way to advance their interests was through the formation of unions, and what we also need to then highlight as collective bargaining. To wrap this discussion up, what we've tried to do is arc from the conditions facing workers to the reaction and the vehicle of change that laborers saw in labor unions, and their ability to collective bargain was the way that between 1880 and 1910 really advanced labor causes throughout America. And the strike was one of the means that was used at this time. Next, we'll turn our attention to societal reactions to capitalism, the emergence of competing ideas in socialism and communism, and even the competing idea of anarchism. But what we'll really want to focus on is how people viewed these changes to society and economics. And what we'll find is that some people champion these as progress, and others saw these in a much focus more on the inequalities that resulted from one man's progress to another man's poverty.